The year was 1847, and the Texas frontier was a place where debts were paid in blood, land, or lives. When Margaret Sullivan stepped off the supply wagon in the dusty settlement of Fort Mackenzie, she carried nothing but a worn leather satchel and a heart full of desperate hope. She had no way of knowing that 50 miles west, Comanche war chief Grey Wolf was riding toward the same fort to collect a debt that would change both their destinies forever. As storm clouds gathered over the windswept plains, neither Margaret nor Grey Wolf could have imagined that a financial arrangement born of desperation would lead to a love that would bridge two worlds and ultimately save an entire people from extinction. The debt that seemed destined to destroy Margaret's future would instead forge a partnership that neither the U.S. Army nor the Comanche Nation had seen coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The letter had arrived at Margaret Sullivan's boarding house in St. Louis on a bitter February morning in 1847, carried by a federal mail courier whose horse was still steaming from the long ride across the Missouri Territory. The envelope bore the official seal of Fort Mackenzie, Texas, and inside was news that would either save Margaret's life or destroy what remained of her carefully constructed world. Miss Sullivan, the letter began in Captain William Harrison's precise military script. Your brother, Lieutenant Thomas Sullivan, has recommended you for a position as civilian medical assistant at our frontier outpost. Given your nursing experience during the cholera outbreak in St. Louis, we are prepared to offer you housing, meals, and $30 monthly salary in exchange for your services tending to soldiers and settlers requiring medical attention. Margaret read the letter 3 times before its full implications settled in her mind. Thomas had found her a way out of St. Louis, away from the gambling debts that threatened to land her in debtor's prison, away from the unwanted advances of her landlord, who had made it clear that her rent could be paid in ways other than money. The position at Fort Mackenzie represented salvation, disguised as opportunity. At 26, Margaret had already lived through more hardship than most women experienced in a lifetime. The daughter of Irish immigrants who had died in a tenement fire when she was 19, she had supported herself through various forms of domestic work until the cholera epidemic of 1845 had revealed her natural aptitude for nursing. For 18 months, she had worked alongside the city's overwhelmed physicians, learning to dress wounds, mix medicines, and provide comfort to the dying with a competence that had earned respect from doctors who rarely acknowledged women's medical capabilities. But respectability didn't pay debts, and Margaret's modest savings had been steadily depleted by the cost of caring for her younger sister Emma, who had contracted consumption the previous winter. Emma's death in January had left Margaret emotionally devastated and financially ruined, with funeral expenses and medical bills that consumed everything she had managed to save. The opportunity at Fort Mackenzie offered more than employment. It promised escape from a city where every street corner reminded her of losses she couldn't afford to grieve. Margaret used her remaining money to purchase passage on a supply wagon, heading southwest through Arkansas and into Texas territory, carrying her few possessions and her last hope for building a stable life. The journey from St. Louis to Fort Mackenzie took 3 weeks, traveling through country that grew increasingly wild and dangerous as they moved away from established settlements. Margaret shared the wagon with 2 other women, Mrs. Elizabeth Porter, a minister's wife joining her husband at a mission near San Antonio, and Sarah Mitchell, a young widow seeking work as a schoolteacher in one of the frontier communities. Elizabeth Porter was a thin, severe woman in her 40s, whose conversation consisted mainly of warnings about the moral dangers of frontier life and lectures about the importance of Christian virtue in civilizing the wilderness. The Indians out here, are not like the peaceful tribes back east, she informed Margaret during their second day of travel. These are Comanche, Apache, and Kiowa warriors who take pleasure in torturing civilized people. A woman alone on this frontier faces temptations and dangers that would shock any decent Christian. Sarah Mitchell offered a different perspective on frontier life, having grown up in a farming community in Arkansas before marrying a merchant who died in a riverboat accident. "The truth is," Sarah told Margaret quietly while Mrs. Porter slept, "the frontier gives women opportunities we'd never have back east. Out here, if you can do the work, people don't care as much about your background or whether you have a husband to speak for you." The wagon train included 12 families heading to various settlements across Texas, escorted by 6 armed guards who maintained constant vigilance against the possibility of Indian raids. Margaret learned to distinguish between different types of threats: wild animals that might attack the livestock, bandits who preyed on isolated travelers, and Indian war parties that could appear without warning across the vast expanse of prairie. The landscape itself was unlike anything Margaret had experienced. The rolling hills and forests of Missouri gave way to endless grasslands broken by occasional rivers and stands of cottonwood trees. The sky seemed impossibly vast, stretching from horizon to horizon without the comforting boundaries of buildings or mountains. At night, the stars were so bright and numerous that Margaret felt overwhelmed by the immensity of space above the small circle of light created by their campfire. Captain Samuel Briggs, the wagon train's military escort, briefed the travelers. Each evening about the territory they would cross the following day. "We are entering Comanche hunting grounds tomorrow," he announced during their second week of travel. "These people have been fighting the Spanish, the Mexicans, and now us Americans for over a century. They know every waterhole, every canyon, every place where a war party can hide until travelers are within arrow range." Margaret listened to these warnings with growing unease, beginning to understand that her brother Thomas had not adequately described the dangers of frontier life. His letters had mentioned occasional Indian troubles, but had focused mainly on the opportunities for advancement and the camaraderie among the soldiers. He had not prepared her for the constant vigilance required to survive in territory where the nearest law enforcement might be hundreds of miles away. The deception became apparent during their final week of travel when Captain Briggs received a dispatch from Fort Mackenzie that changed everything Margaret thought she understood about her situation. The message was delivered by a lone rider who had pushed his horse hard across 50 miles of dangerous territory to reach their wagon train. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Briggs announced after reading the dispatch, "I have some disturbing news about conditions at Fort Mackenzie. It appears that the fort has been under siege by Comanche war parties for the past 2 weeks. Several soldiers have been killed, and the situation is complicated." Margaret felt her stomach drop as Captain Briggs continued his explanation. Fort Mackenzie was not the secure military outpost that Thomas had described in his letters. It was an isolated frontier garrison surrounded by hostile territory, barely maintaining its existence through a series of temporary truces and armed standoffs with the indigenous tribes whose land it occupied. "Miss Sullivan," Captain Briggs said, addressing Margaret directly, "your brother, Lieutenant Sullivan, asked me to inform you that the medical position he described in his letter may not be exactly what you were expecting. The fort surgeon was killed in a Comanche raid 3 weeks ago, which means you would be the primary medical authority for a garrison of 47 soldiers and approximately 30 civilian settlers." The reality of Margaret's situation began to crystallize with terrifying clarity. She had traveled over 800 miles to accept a position that didn't exist in a fort that was under active siege, to work as a doctor, despite having no formal medical training beyond what she had learned during the cholera epidemic. Her brother had misrepresented virtually every aspect of the opportunity he had offered her. Mrs. Porter, who had been listening with increasing alarm, turned to Margaret with an expression of horror. "My dear girl, you cannot possibly continue to such a place. A young woman alone, surrounded by soldiers and savages with no proper supervision or protection. It would be scandalous beyond imagination." But Margaret had no alternatives. She had spent her last money on passage to Texas, had no funds for return travel to St. Louis, and faced debtor's prison if she returned to Missouri without means to pay what she owed. The position at Fort McKenzie, however misrepresented, was her only option for survival. Sarah Mitchell, recognizing Margaret's dilemma, offered what comfort she could. "You're stronger than you think," she told Margaret privately. "I've watched you help injured travelers, tend sick children, and handle problems that sent grown men into panic. You have medical knowledge that could save lives out here, even if you don't have a diploma from some Eastern medical college." The final 3 days of travel to Fort McKenzie passed in tense silence as Margaret contemplated the enormous gap between her expectations and the reality awaiting her. She had been recruited under false pretenses to serve in a capacity for which she was unqualified, in a location that was far more dangerous than anything Thomas had described in his letters. Fort McKenzie appeared on the horizon as a cluster of wooden buildings surrounded by a stockade fence, looking small and vulnerable against the immensity of the Texas plains. Smoke rose from cooking fires within the compound, and Margaret could see soldiers moving along the walls, maintaining watch against threats that might approach from any direction. As their wagon approached the fort's main gate, Margaret noticed details that confirmed her worst fears about the situation she was entering. The stockade walls showed evidence of recent repairs where bullets and arrows had damaged the wood. Several buildings bore scorch marks from fires that had been hastily extinguished. The garrison's flag flew at half-mast, indicating recent casualties. Among the soldiers or civilians, Captain Briggs handled the formal introductions at the fort's gate, presenting Margaret to Lieutenant Thomas Sullivan with an efficiency that barely concealed his relief at completing a dangerous escort mission. Thomas looked older than Margaret remembered, weathered by frontier life and bearing the kind of tension that came from months of constant vigilance against attack. "Maggie," Thomas said, embracing his sister with genuine affection while his eyes remained fixed on the horizon beyond the fort's walls. "I'm glad you made it safely. We've had some trouble lately, but nothing we can't handle with proper medical support." Margaret studied her brother's face, seeing exhaustion and worry that contradicted his confident words. The trouble he mentioned so casually was clearly far more serious than he was willing to admit, and Margaret was beginning to understand that her arrival at Fort McKenzie marked the beginning of challenges she had never imagined facing. But as the wagon train departed and the fort's gates closed behind her, Margaret realized that her journey into deception and danger was only just beginning. What she didn't know was that her arrival had been observed by scouts from Grey Wolf's war party, who even now were riding back to their chief with news that would set in motion events that would test every assumption both cultures held about courage, loyalty, and the possibility of finding common ground in a landscape defined by conflict. The debt that would soon bring Grey Wolf to Fort McKenzie had nothing to do with Margaret Sullivan, but everything to do with the survival of both, his people and hers. And neither the Comanche warrior nor the Irish nurse could have predicted that their paths would intersect in ways that would challenge everything they believed about their enemies and themselves. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The interior of Fort McKenzie struck Margaret like a physical blow. What Thomas had described as a thriving frontier outpost was revealed to be a desperate collection of wounded men, frightened civilians, and structures that bore the scars of recent violence. The moment she stepped through the gates, Margaret was confronted with the unmistakable stench of infection, unwashed bodies, and fear. "Doc Sullivan!" called out Sergeant Major Reynolds, a grizzled veteran whose left arm hung in a makeshift sling. "Thank the Lord you're here. We got 7 men down with fever, 3 with arrow wounds that ain't healing right, and Private Morrison's been asking for laudanum since yesterday." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. These men were calling her doctor, based on Thomas's assurances, but her medical knowledge consisted entirely of what she'd learned during the cholera outbreak: basic wound cleaning, fever management, and comfort care for the dying. She was no more qualified to treat arrow wounds than she was to command the garrison. "Sergeant Reynolds," Thomas interjected quickly, "my sister needs time to get settled before she begins her duties. Perhaps you could show her to the medical quarters?" The medical quarters turned out to be a single room in a log building that had clearly been designed for storage rather than treatment. A rough wooden table served as an examination surface, and the medical supplies consisted of a few bottles of whiskey, some torn cloth for bandages, and a leather pouch containing instruments that looked more suitable for carpentry than surgery. Dr. Marcus Webb, the fort's previous surgeon, had been killed 2 weeks earlier when a Comanche raiding party overran a supply convoy. His medical notes, scattered across a desk thick with dust, revealed the scope of challenges Margaret would face. The garrison was dealing with multiple cases of dysentery, several infected wounds that showed signs of gangrene, and chronic malnutrition that made everyone more susceptible to disease. "Thomas," Margaret said quietly after Sergeant Reynolds had left them alone, "I cannot do this work. I've never performed surgery, never treated gunshot wounds, never dealt with anything more serious than fever and basic wound cleaning. These men need a real doctor." Thomas sat heavily on a wooden crate, and for the first time since her arrival, Margaret saw the full extent of his exhaustion. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his hands trembled slightly as he ran them through. His unwashed hair. "Maggie, there is no real doctor. The nearest physician is in San Antonio, over 200 miles away across Indian territory. Even if we could get word to him, he wouldn't come here. No qualified doctor would risk his life for a frontier garrison that might not exist next month." The weight of her situation settled on Margaret like a physical burden. She was trapped at Fort Mackenzie with no means of escape, responsible for medical care she was unqualified to provide, surrounded by men whose lives might depend on skills she didn't possess. "What about the civilians?" Margaret asked, noting the presence of women and children within the fort's walls. "Surely some of them have medical knowledge." Thomas shook his head grimly. "Most of the families are here because their homesteads were burned out by Comanche raids. They arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Martha Rodriguez knows something about childbirth, and old Pete Morrison can set broken bones. If you hold him steady enough, but that's the extent of our medical expertise." Margaret walked to the small window that looked out on the fort's central courtyard, watching the daily routines of people living under siege. Children played games that mimicked warfare, while their mothers maintained constant vigilance for signs of approaching danger. Soldiers moved with the careful efficiency of men who had learned that carelessness could be fatal. "Thomas, tell me the truth about our situation. How long can this fort hold out against sustained attack?" Her brother was quiet for a long moment, clearly debating how much honesty Margaret could handle. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had been carrying impossible responsibilities for too long. "We have ammunition for perhaps 10 days of serious fighting. Food stores might last 6 weeks if we ration strictly. Our biggest problem isn't supplies, though. It's manpower. We started with 62 soldiers. We're down to 47, and 8 of those are too sick or wounded to fight effectively." Margaret absorbed this information, beginning to understand that Fort Mackenzie existed in a state of barely controlled crisis. The garrison was outnumbered, undersupplied, and surrounded by hostile territory, held together only by the determination of people who had nowhere else to go. What about reinforcements? Surely the army won't abandon an established fort, Thomas laughed bitterly. The army is fighting a war with Mexico, dealing with Indian troubles across 3 territories, and trying to protect settlements from here to California. Fort McKenzie is expendable compared to larger strategic objectives. The reality of frontier military policy was harsh and simple. Small outposts like Fort McKenzie served as early warning systems for Indian raids and symbolic assertions of American territorial claims, but they were not considered worth major resource investments. If the garrison could defend itself, it would be supported. If it couldn't, it would be abandoned. Margaret's first medical emergency came before she had finished unpacking her belongings. Corporal James Patterson was carried into the medical quarters by 2 of his fellow soldiers, his face grey with pain and his shirt soaked with blood from a wound that had reopened during guard duty. "Got this from a Comanche lance 3 days ago," Patterson explained through gritted teeth. "Doc Webb cleaned it out before he got killed, but it ain't healing right. Keeps bleeding and it smells bad." Margaret examined the wound with hands that trembled despite her efforts to maintain professional composure. The lance had penetrated Patterson's side, just below his ribs, creating a deep puncture that showed clear signs of infection. The surrounding skin was hot and red, and the wound itself was producing a foul-smelling discharge that indicated serious bacterial contamination. Drawing on her experience during the cholera epidemic, Margaret cleaned the wound with whiskey and hot water, removed what infected tissue she could identify, and applied a poultice made from herbs that Martha Rodriguez had recommended. The process took over an hour, during which Patterson remained conscious but clearly in agony. "Will he live?" asked Private Collins, one of the soldiers who had carried Patterson to the medical quarters. Margaret honestly didn't know. The infection was advanced. Patterson was weakened by poor nutrition and the stress of constant vigilance, and she lacked the medical knowledge to determine whether her treatment would be effective. But Patterson and the other soldiers were looking at her with the desperate hope of people who had no other options. "The wound is serious, but we've cleaned out the infection and applied treatment," Margaret said, choosing her words carefully. "Corporal Patterson needs rest, proper nutrition, and time for his body to heal. I'll check the wound twice daily and adjust treatment as needed." Her response seemed to satisfy the soldiers, who carried Patterson to a sleeping area and left Margaret alone with the sobering realization that she had just performed her first serious medical procedure based on guesswork and desperation. If Patterson recovered, it would be due more to luck than skill. If he died, the responsibility would be entirely hers. The remainder of Margaret's first week at Fort McKenzie established patterns that would define her existence for the foreseeable future. She spent her mornings treating soldiers and civilians who required medical attention, learning through trial and error which treatments seemed effective and which were useless or potentially harmful. Her patients included Private Carson, who suffered from chronic dysentery that had left him dangerously dehydrated, Mrs. Jennifer Hamilton, whose baby showed signs of malnutrition, and Sergeant Willis, whose broken arm had been poorly set and was healing incorrectly. Each case presented challenges that tested Margaret's limited knowledge and forced her to improvise solutions based on common sense and careful observation. Evenings were devoted to studying Dr. Webb's medical notes and the few medical texts that had survived his death. Margaret discovered that Webb had been a competent frontier physician who understood the limitations of practicing medicine in isolation from medical communities and advanced treatments. His notes contained practical advice about treating common frontier ailments, managing limited supplies, and maintaining morale among patients who faced uncertain prognoses. The fort's social dynamics proved as challenging as the medical work. Margaret was the only unmarried woman among the civilians, a situation that created tension with some of the married women who viewed her with suspicion and unwanted attention from soldiers who saw her as potential romantic interest. Mrs. Catherine Morrison, the wife of the fort's quartermaster, made her position clear during Margaret's third day at the fort. A young woman alone among all these men creates complications. People talk, you understand. Questions arise about propriety and Christian behavior. Margaret understood perfectly. Her unmarried status and professional responsibilities placed her in a category that frontier society hadn't adequately defined. She was neither a traditional frontier wife nor a camp follower, but something in between that made everyone uncomfortable. The solution came from an unexpected source. Martha Rodriguez, a Mexican woman whose husband had been killed in a Comanche raid, approached Margaret with a proposal that would address both social concerns and practical needs. "Señorita Sullivan, you need someone to help with the medical work, and I need respectable employment that provides housing and food. Perhaps we could work together? I know much about healing herbs and treating injuries. My grandmother was a curandera in Mexico." The partnership with Martha proved invaluable. Martha's knowledge of traditional healing methods complemented Margaret's experience with epidemic medicine, and her presence provided the social protection that Margaret needed to function effectively in the fort's male-dominated environment. Together, they transformed the medical quarters into a more organized treatment facility, cataloging supplies, organizing instruments, and establishing protocols for handling different types of medical emergencies. Martha's herb garden, planted behind the medical building, provided treatments that the fort's limited pharmaceutical supplies couldn't offer. But it was during her second week at Fort Mackenzie that Margaret first heard the name that would change everything: Grey Wolf. The name was spoken with a mixture of fear and respect by soldiers who had encountered the Comanche war chief in battle, and with something approaching reverence by the few civilians who understood the complex politics of Indian relations. "Grey Wolf's been raiding supply convoys between here and San Antonio," Thomas explained during one of their evening conversations. "He's not just some renegade warrior causing random trouble. He's a strategic thinker who understands exactly how to pressure frontier settlements without triggering massive military retaliation." Captain Harrison, the fort's commanding officer, provided additional context during a briefing that included Margaret because of her civilian leadership role. "Grey Wolf represents a new generation of Comanche leadership. He speaks English, understands American military tactics, and seems to know more about our supply schedules than some of our own officers." What nobody at Fort Mackenzie understood was that Grey Wolf's raids were not random acts of aggression, but carefully calculated moves in a larger strategy to force negotiations that might preserve some portion of Comanche territory. The war chief was fighting for the survival of his people, using the only methods available to someone whose enemy possessed overwhelming advantages in numbers and equipment. The debt that would soon bring Grey Wolf to Fort Mackenzie was the culmination of months of careful planning. It involved a missing supply shipment, a broken treaty agreement, and a series of misunderstandings that had escalated into open conflict. But none of that was known to Margaret as she established her new life as the fort's unlikely medical authority. What Margaret did know was that every day brought new challenges that tested her capabilities and forced her to grow beyond anything she had imagined possible. She was becoming someone she had never expected to be, a frontier healer whose skills were being forged in the crucible of necessity and whose character was being shaped by the responsibility of caring for people who had no one else to turn to. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would bring together two people from completely different worlds. United by circumstances neither had chosen, but both would have to navigate with courage, wisdom, and the kind of strength that only emerges when survival depends on seeing beyond the boundaries of prejudice and fear. 3 weeks into Margaret's tenure at Fort Mackenzie, the fragile balance that had kept the garrison functioning began to unravel in ways that would test every skill she had developed and force decisions that no medical training could have prepared her for. The trouble began with the disappearance of Private Daniel Brooks during what should have been a routine patrol of the fort's perimeter. Brooks was an experienced frontier soldier who knew the signs of Comanche presence and understood the importance of staying within protective range of the fort's walls. His failure to return from a 2-hour reconnaissance mission sent ripples of alarm through the entire garrison. Captain Harrison organized search parties immediately, but the vast expanse of prairie surrounding Fort Mackenzie offered endless possibilities for where a man might disappear. Brooks could have been captured, killed, injured, and unable to signal for help, or simply lost in terrain that looked deceptively similar across miles of rolling grassland. "The Comanche don't usually take prisoners during small raids, Sergeant," Reynolds explained to Margaret as she prepared medical supplies for the search parties. "But Grey Wolf's been different from other war chiefs. He seems to understand the psychological value of keeping his enemies uncertain about his intentions." The search for Private Brooks consumed 3 days and revealed disturbing evidence of increased Comanche activity around the fort. The patrol teams found tracks indicating that war parties had been conducting surveillance operations much closer to Fort Mackenzie than anyone had realized. Fresh horse signs showed that groups of riders had approached within rifle range of the walls, studying the garrison's defenses and daily routines. On the morning of the 4th day, Brooks's horse returned to the fort without its rider. The animal bore clear signs of having been deliberately released rather than having escaped, and attached to its saddle was a bundle of items that made the situation's gravity unmistakable. The bundle contained Brooks's military jacket, his rifle, and a message written in English on a piece of birch bark. The message was brief and direct. "Captain Harrison, your soldier lives. We will discuss terms for his return. 3 days. Come, alone, to Willow Creek at sunset. Bring the woman healer, Grey Wolf." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face as Captain Harrison read the message aloud to his assembled officers. The Comanche war chief was not only demanding a meeting, but specifically requesting her presence. The implications were both terrifying and puzzling. Why would he want Margaret there? Thomas asked, voicing the question that everyone was thinking. What possible interest could a Comanche war chief have in our medical officer? Captain Harrison studied the message again, looking for clues about Grey Wolf's motivations. It could be that he has wounded warriors who need medical attention, or he might be testing our willingness to negotiate by demanding something valuable to us. Martha Rodriguez, who had been quietly listening to the discussion, offered a different perspective based on her knowledge of Indian cultures. "Among my people, healers are often included in important negotiations because they represent life rather than death. Perhaps this Grey Wolf sees medical knowledge as neutral ground where enemies can meet safely." The debate over how to respond to Grey Wolf's message consumed the rest of the day. Some officers advocated for refusing the meeting entirely, arguing that it was obviously a trap designed to capture or kill the fort's leadership. Others believed that Private Brooks's life was worth the risk of negotiation, especially if it might lead to broader discussions about reducing Comanche raids. Margaret found herself at the center of a decision she had never expected to face. Grey Wolf had specifically requested her presence, making her participation essential if the meeting was to proceed. But the prospect of riding into Comanche territory, even under a flag of truce, represented dangers that her imagination could barely process. "I need to understand what we're really discussing," Margaret said during the evening strategy session. Is this purely about exchanging private brooks for medical treatment, or are we talking about something larger that might affect the fort's long-term survival? Captain Harrison's response revealed the broader context that had been building for months. Miss Sullivan, Fort Mackenzie exists because of a treaty signed 3 years ago that promised certain provisions to local Indian tribes in exchange for safe passage of military and civilian traffic. Those provisions have not been delivered as promised, creating the debt that Grey Wolf is now calling in. The missing provisions included medical supplies, blankets and food that had been designated for distribution to Comanche bands as part of the original peace agreement. Bureaucratic delays, supply chain problems, and shifting military priorities had resulted in the promised goods never reaching their intended recipients. So Grey Wolf's raids haven't been random acts of aggression, Margaret realized. He's been trying to collect what was already owed to his people under legal agreements. Thomas nodded grimly. The problem is that the supplies promised in the treaty were never actually shipped to Fort Mackenzie. We've been trying to maintain peace with agreements we had no ability to fulfill. The moral complexity of the situation became clear as Margaret learned more about the circumstances that had led to the current crisis. The United States government had negotiated treaties in good faith, but the practical realities of frontier logistics had made it impossible to deliver on those promises. Meanwhile, Comanche bands had honored their part of the agreements by reducing raids and allowing safe passage for American settlers and military personnel. Grey Wolf's current actions represented a calculated attempt to force resolution of a conflict that had been created by institutional failures rather than personal animosity. He was not a savage seeking random violence, but a leader trying to secure survival for his people through the only methods available to someone whose legal agreements had been broken. What exactly does Grey Wolf expect us to provide? Margaret asked, beginning to understand that the meeting at Willow Creek would involve more than simply exchanging a prisoner for medical services. Captain Harrison consulted his records of the original treaty provisions. Medical supplies valued at approximately $800, 50 blankets, and food provisions equivalent to what would feed 30 people for 3 months. The total value of our debt to the Comanche is significant, but not impossible to satisfy if we had the resources. The problem was that Fort Mackenzie lacked the authority to negotiate new treaty terms and didn't possess the supplies needed to fulfill the original agreement. The garrison was barely maintaining its own survival, with no surplus resources available for distribution to Indian tribes. Margaret spent the evening before the scheduled meeting preparing medical supplies that might serve as partial payment for the fort's debt to Grey Wolf's people. She gathered what medicine she could spare, assembled basic surgical instruments, and prepared written instructions for treating common ailments that could be translated for Comanche healers. "You don't have to do this," Thomas told her as she organized her medical bag for the journey to Willow Creek. Grey Wolf's message didn't specify consequences if we refused to meet. We could simply ignore his demands and hope that he eventually loses interest. Margaret considered this option, but rejected it based on her growing understanding of the situation's underlying dynamics. "Thomas, if we ignore Grey Wolf's attempt at negotiation, he'll have no choice but to escalate his raids until he gets attention. More soldiers will be wounded, more civilians will be killed, and we'll still end up negotiating from a weaker position." Martha Rodriguez supported Margaret's reasoning. "This Grey Wolf has shown restraint by capturing rather than killing Private Brooks. He could have sent the soldier's scalp instead of a request for negotiation. This suggests that he prefers talking to fighting when talking might accomplish his goals." The morning of the meeting dawned clear and still, with the kind of crystalline air that made distances deceptive across the prairie landscape. Margaret and Captain Harrison prepared for the journey to Willow Creek with the solemnity of people. undertaking a mission that could determine the fort's survival. The ride to Willow Creek took 2 hours across terrain that gradually transitioned from open prairie to more broken country cut by small streams and dotted with stands of cottonwood. Trees. Margaret had never ventured so far from Fort Mackenzie's protective walls, and she found herself constantly scanning the horizon for signs of Comanche presence. "How will we know if this is a trap?" Margaret asked as they approached the creek that marked their destination. Captain Harrison checked his pocket watch, noting that they had arrived 15 minutes before the agreed meeting time. "We won't know until it's too late to matter. But Grey Wolf's reputation suggests that he honors agreements when it serves his purposes. If he wanted us dead, there are easier ways to accomplish that than elaborate negotiations." Willow Creek proved to be a natural meeting place, with clear sightlines in all directions and fresh water that would be valuable to any group traveling across the prairie. Ancient cottonwood trees provided shade and created a sense of neutral space that belonged to neither culture. They waited in tense silence as the sun moved toward the horizon, each minute stretching into what felt like hours. Margaret organized and reorganized her medical supplies, while Captain Harrison maintained watch for approaching riders. At precisely sunset, Grey Wolf appeared. He emerged from a stand of trees 500 yards away, riding alone across the open ground between the creek and his concealed position. Margaret's first impression was of someone who moved with the confidence of a person completely comfortable in dangerous circumstances. Grey Wolf was younger than Margaret had expected, probably in his early 30s, with the kind of physical presence that commanded attention without seeming to demand it. He wore traditional Comanche clothing, adapted with practical modifications that suggested extensive contact with American culture. His horse was magnificent, a spotted pinto that moved with the fluid grace of an animal bred for speed and endurance. Most surprisingly, Grey Wolf was completely alone. No backup warriors were visible, no signs of hidden support, just a single man riding to meet potential enemies with what appeared to be complete confidence in his ability to handle whatever might develop. As he approached within speaking distance, Margaret noticed details that contradicted everything she had been told about Comanche war chiefs. Grey Wolf's weapons were visible, but not threatening positioned. His posture suggested readiness for conversation rather than combat, and his expression showed intelligence and calculation rather than hostility. "Captain Harrison," Grey Wolf said, in clear English, as he brought his horse to a stop 20 feet away, "and you must be the woman healer that my scouts have described. I'm Grey Wolf, war chief of the Eastern Comanche, and I have come to discuss a debt that has been too long unpaid." Margaret felt her breath catch as she realized that everything she thought she knew about this meeting was about to change. Grey Wolf wasn't the savage warrior she had been conditioned to expect, but someone whose presence suggested capabilities and intentions far more complex than simple revenge or random violence. The debt he had come to collect involved more than missing treaty provisions. It represented the beginning of negotiations that would test everything Margaret and Captain Harrison thought they understood about survival, justice, and the possibility of finding common ground between cultures that had been taught to see each other as irreconcilable enemies. As Grey Wolf dismounted and walked toward them with the measured pace of someone accustomed to command, Margaret prepared herself for a conversation that would determine not only Private Brooks's fate, but the future of everyone who called Fort Mackenzie home. The first words Grey Wolf spoke shattered every preconception Margaret had formed about Comanche war chiefs. Instead of threats or demands, he opened their negotiation with a question that revealed depths of understanding she hadn't expected. "Miss Sullivan, my scouts tell me that you have been healing soldiers and civilians at the fort with great skill, despite having no formal training as a medicine man." This suggests that you understand the difference between knowledge that comes from books and wisdom that comes from necessity. Is this correct? Margaret found herself momentarily speechless, caught off guard by both the question's sophistication and Grey Wolf's obvious knowledge of her background. She had expected demands for ransom or threats of violence, not philosophical inquiries about the nature of medical practice. "I've learned what I could from treating people who needed help," Margaret replied carefully. "Sometimes that meant using methods that weren't taught in medical schools, but seemed to work better than traditional treatments." Grey Wolf nodded approvingly. "This is why I requested your presence at this meeting. My people are facing a sickness that our traditional healers cannot cure. Many have died, including children and elders whose loss weakens our entire tribe. I believe you might possess knowledge that could save lives that are precious to us." Captain Harrison shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, clearly expecting this conversation to focus on military matters rather than medical cooperation. "Grey Wolf, we came here to discuss the return of Private Brooks and the resolution of treaty obligations. I'm not sure that medical consultation is appropriate under current circumstances." Grey Wolf's expression hardened slightly as he turned his attention to the captain. "Private Brooks is safe and will be returned when our business is concluded satisfactorily. But the treaty obligations you mention are precisely why medical assistance has become necessary. The supplies your government promised included medicines that would have prevented the sickness now killing my people." The war chief's explanation revealed the cruel irony underlying their current situation. The medical supplies that had been promised to the Comanche under the original treaty would have prevented the epidemic that was now devastating his tribe. The government's failure to honor its commitments had created a crisis that was forcing Grey Wolf to seek help from the very people who had broken their promises. "What kind of sickness are your people experiencing?" Margaret asked, her professional instincts overriding the political complexities of the situation. "Can you describe the symptoms?" Grey Wolf's description of the illness affecting his tribe painted a picture that Margaret recognized with growing alarm. High fevers, severe diarrhea, dehydration, and a distinctive rash that appeared on the third day of symptoms. The combination pointed to typhoid fever, a disease that could devastate populations lacking immunity or proper sanitation. "How many of your people have been affected?" Margaret inquired, already calculating what medical supplies might be needed to address an epidemic. 43 have fallen sick in the past 2 weeks. 18 have died, including 7 children under 10 years of age. Our medicine men have tried traditional treatments, but the sickness seems to resist everything they attempt." Margaret felt the weight of Grey Wolf's revelation settling on her shoulders. Typhoid fever was treatable if caught early and managed properly, but it required specific medicines and strict sanitation protocols that would be difficult to implement in a nomadic tribal setting. "The medicine you need exists," Margaret said slowly, "but treating typhoid fever requires more than just giving people certain drugs. It requires changes in how water is handled, how waste is disposed of, how food is prepared and stored. Some of these changes might conflict with traditional Comanche practices." Grey Wolf studied Margaret's face with the intensity of someone evaluating a potential ally's trustworthiness. "You speak of changing our ways, as if you understand that this might be difficult for proud people to accept. Most white healers assume that their methods are automatically superior to ours without considering what such changes might cost." The conversation was moving into territory that neither Margaret nor Captain Harrison had anticipated. Instead of simple negotiations about prisoner exchange or supply deliveries, they were discussing cultural adaptation and medical cooperation that would require unprecedented trust between traditional enemies. "I'm not suggesting that Comanche ways are wrong," Margaret clarified. "I'm saying that some diseases require specific responses regardless of cultural background. Typhoid fever kills people the same way, whether they're white, Mexican, or Comanche. The treatments that work are based on understanding how the disease spreads, not on which culture developed them. Grey Wolf dismounted and approached Margaret with the measured steps of someone making a significant decision. "Miss Sullivan, I propose an exchange that might serve both our people's needs. I will return Private Brooks and cease raids against Fort Mackenzie in exchange for your assistance in treating the sickness affecting my tribe." Captain Harrison immediately objected. "I cannot authorize sending our medical officer into Comanche territory. Miss Sullivan's safety cannot be guaranteed, and the fort needs her services for our own people. The fort's people will remain healthy, as long as my warriors do not attack them," Grey Wolf replied with quiet authority. "But my people will continue dying without proper medical assistance. Miss Sullivan would be under my personal protection, safer in my camp than many white women are in their own settlements." Margaret found herself facing a decision that went far beyond her role as the fort's medical officer. Grey Wolf was offering her the opportunity to practice medicine on a scale that could save dozens of lives, but it would require trusting her safety to someone she had been taught to consider an enemy. "How long would this arrangement last?" Margaret asked, trying to understand the full scope of what Grey Wolf was proposing. "Until the sickness is defeated and my people are healthy again. Perhaps 2 weeks, perhaps longer, depending on how quickly the treatments prove effective. During this time, you would live among us, observe our ways, and teach us what we need to know to prevent future epidemics." The proposal represented an unprecedented opportunity for cultural exchange, but it also involved risks that made Captain Harrison visibly uncomfortable. Sending the fort's only medical authority into Comanche territory violated every military protocol he had been trained to follow. "Miss Sullivan," Captain Harrison said carefully, "I must remind you that you are under military protection at Fort Mackenzie. I cannot order you to accept this arrangement, but I also cannot guarantee your rescue if something goes wrong." Margaret considered the moral dimensions of Grey Wolf's proposal. 18 people had already died from a disease she might be able to treat effectively. More would die without intervention, including children whose deaths could be prevented with proper medical care. Against this certain tragedy, the risks to her personal safety seemed less significant. "I'd need guarantees about my ability to return to Fort Mackenzie when the medical work is completed," Margaret said, addressing Grey Wolf directly. "And I need assurance that my medical authority will be respected, even when it conflicts with traditional practices." Grey Wolf extended his hand in a gesture that bridged the cultural divide between them. "You have my word as a war chief, and my promise as someone whose children's lives may depend on your knowledge. You will be honored among my people as a healer whose wisdom serves life rather than death." The handshake that sealed their agreement lasted only seconds, but it marked the beginning of a partnership that would challenge every assumption both in cultures held about their enemies. Margaret was committing herself to work that was more dangerous and more important than anything she had previously attempted. Captain Harrison watched their agreement with obvious reluctance, but he understood the strategic value of what Margaret was undertaking. If this arrangement succeeds, it could establish the foundation for lasting peace between Fort Mackenzie and the eastern Comanche. If it fails, people die who might have been saved," Margaret finished. "That's a risk I'm willing to accept if it means preventing more deaths from disease or warfare." Grey Wolf's immediate return of Private Brooks demonstrated his commitment to honoring agreements. The soldier appeared from the same stand of trees where Grey Wolf had originally emerged, riding his own horse and showing no signs of mistreatment. Brooks was tired and obviously shaken by his experience as a captive, but physically unharmed. "They treated me well," Brooks reported to Captain Harrison. "Fed me properly, didn't hurt me, even gave me blankets at night." Grey Wolf spoke with me several times, asking questions about fort defenses, but also about why white settlers keep moving west into Indian territory. Grey Wolf's treatment of his prisoner revealed tactical sophistication that impressed even Captain Harrison. Rather than simply holding Brooks as leverage, the war chief had used the captivity as an opportunity to gather intelligence about American motivations and military capabilities. "Miss Sullivan," Grey Wolf said as they prepared, "to finalize their arrangement, there is something you should understand about the work you are agreeing to undertake. The sickness affecting my people began after we moved our camp near a water source that may have been contaminated by runoff from white settlements upstream. This epidemic represents more than just medical crisis. It shows how our people's lives are becoming interconnected whether we intend it or not." Margaret grasped the broader implications of Grey Wolf's observation. The typhoid outbreak was not an isolated medical emergency, but a consequence of environmental changes caused by westward expansion. As white settlements multiplied across traditional Indian territories, they were creating new pathways for disease transmission that affected everyone regardless of racial or cultural boundaries. "You're saying that our futures are linked whether we cooperate or fight," Margaret realized. "Environmental problems, disease outbreaks, resource conflicts, they're going to affect both our peoples whether we work together or remain enemies." Grey Wolf nodded, pleased that Margaret understood the larger context surrounding their immediate medical crisis. "A wise healer sees connections between things that others view as separate problems. This is why I believe you can help my people in ways that go beyond treating the current sickness." As they made final arrangements for Margaret's departure to the Comanche camp, Captain Harrison pulled her aside for a private conversation that revealed his deeper concerns about the risks she was accepting. "Margaret, what you're attempting has never been tried before. A white woman living among hostile Indians, practicing medicine that challenges their traditional beliefs, trusting her safety to people we've been fighting for months. If this goes wrong, there may be no way to help you." Margaret understood Captain Harrison's concerns, but she also recognized that the opportunity Grey Wolf was offering represented something rare and precious. The chance to save lives while building bridges between cultures that had been taught to see each other as irreconcilable enemies was worth risks that might seem impossible to justify under normal circumstances. "Captain, everything about frontier life involves risks that would seem insane to people back east. I've been practicing medicine without proper training, treating diseases I've never seen before, making life and death decisions based on guesswork and intuition. At least this time I'm taking risks that might prevent suffering rather than just responding to it after it's already occurred." As sunset painted the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, Margaret prepared to leave everything familiar behind and enter a world that no white woman had ever experienced as Grey Wolf's honored guest and trusted healer. The debt that had brought them together was about to become the foundation for cooperation that neither culture had imagined possible. The journey to Grey Wolf's camp took place under a canopy of stars that seemed impossibly bright against the vast darkness of the Texas prairie. Margaret rode beside the Comanche war chief through terrain that looked alien and dangerous in the moonlight, her medical supplies secured behind her saddle and her nerves stretched taut by the magnitude of what she had undertaken. Grey Wolf maintained a steady pace that covered ground efficiently without exhausting their horses, periodically stopping to check landmarks that were invisible to Margaret, but clearly meaningful to someone who had spent his life navigating by natural signs. During these brief pauses, he explained elements of Comanche travel techniques that revealed the sophistication of indigenous knowledge systems. White travelers follow roads and rivers because they need obvious paths to guide them, Grey Wolf observed as they paused near a cluster of distinctive rock formations. We follow star patterns, wind directions, plant growth, and animal behavior because these signs never lie and cannot be destroyed by enemies. Margaret found herself fascinated by Grey Wolf's casual demonstrations of environmental awareness that far exceeded anything she had learned during her journey west. He could determine their precise location by observing which plants grew in specific soil conditions, predict weather changes by noting shifts in bird flight patterns, and navigate across seemingly featureless prairie by reading subtle variations in topography. "How did you learn to speak English so well?" Margaret asked during one of their rest stops, curious about the cultural background that had produced such an unexpected combination of traditional knowledge and cross-cultural communication skills. Grey Wolf's answer revealed personal history that complicated everything Margaret thought she understood about Indian-white relations. "I was captured by Texas Rangers when I was 14 years old, during a raid that killed my father and several other warriors. Instead of executing me, they sold me to a rancher named Samuel Carson, who needed workers and thought a young Indian might be useful for jobs that were too dangerous for white men." The story Grey Wolf told during their night ride painted a picture of cultural exchange that was far more complex than the simple conflict narratives that dominated frontier thinking. Carson had treated Grey Wolf more like an adopted son than a slave, teaching him English, mathematics, and agricultural techniques, while learning Comanche horsemanship, hunting methods, and survival skills. Samuel Carson was a good man who understood. That knowledge belongs to whoever can use it wisely, regardless of their birth, Grey Wolf continued. He taught me to read and write, showed me how white men conduct business, and explained the political forces that were driving westward expansion. In return, I taught him and his sons how to live successfully in Comanche territory. Margaret began to understand that Grey Wolf's current leadership position stemmed partly from his unique ability to understand both cultures and anticipate how their collision would affect his people's survival. His raids against Fort Mackenzie were not expressions of hatred, but strategic moves designed to force negotiations that might preserve some portion of Comanche independence. Samuel Carson died 3 years ago from lung sickness, Grey Wolf concluded. Before he died, he told me that the future belonged to people who could build bridges between different worlds, rather than walls between enemies. I believe he was right, which is why I asked for your help instead of simply continuing to raid until Fort Mackenzie was abandoned. They reached the Comanche camp just before dawn, as the eastern horizon began showing the first traces of light that would reveal the full scope of the medical crisis Margaret had agreed to address. The camp was larger than she had expected, consisting of over 60 teepees arranged in family clusters along a creek that provided fresh water for both people and horses. Grey Wolf led her directly to the center of the camp, where a large teepee had been converted into a treatment area for the most seriously ill patients. The scene inside was devastating. 12 people lay on buffalo robes, all showing advanced symptoms of typhoid fever. Their faces were flushed with fever, their bodies racked with the violent diarrhea that could quickly lead to fatal dehydration. "These are the worst cases," explained Running Bear, an elderly medicine man who greeted Margaret with cautious respect. "We have tried everything our traditions teach us about fighting sickness, but nothing has helped. 3 died yesterday, including a baby girl who was only 8 months old." Margaret knelt beside the first patient, a middle-aged woman whose breathing was labored and whose skin showed the dangerous grey pallor that indicated severe dehydration. Using techniques she had learned during the cholera epidemic in St. Louis, Margaret began assessing the patient's condition and determining what immediate interventions might stabilize her. "The first thing we need to do is get fluids into people who can still swallow," Margaret explained to Running Bear and the other Comanche healers who had gathered to observe her methods. Clean water mixed with salt and sugar can replace what the body loses through fever and diarrhea. It's not a cure, but it can keep people alive long enough for other treatments to work. The challenge was not just medical, but cultural. Margaret needed to convince traditional healers to accept methods that contradicted their established practices, while simultaneously respecting the knowledge systems that had sustained Comanche healthcare for generations. Running Bear proved to be an invaluable ally in navigating these cultural complexities. Despite his initial skepticism about white medical practices, he recognized that traditional Comanche treatments were failing against this particular disease and was willing to experiment with new approaches if they showed promise. "Your medicine uses different plants and different procedures than ours," Running Bear observed as Margaret prepared her first batch of oral rehydration solution. "But the goal is the same, to help the body fight off whatever is making it sick. Perhaps different sicknesses require different types of healing." Margaret's first day in the Comanche camp established patterns of collaboration that would define her entire stay. She worked alongside Comanche healers, explaining the reasoning behind her treatments while learning about traditional remedies that might complement modern medical approaches. The oral rehydration therapy proved immediately effective for patients who were conscious enough to drink. Within hours, several people who had been near death began showing signs of improvement as their bodies absorbed the fluids and electrolytes needed to maintain basic physiological functions. But Margaret's most significant breakthrough came when she observed how the Comanche camp's water and sanitation systems might be contributing to the epidemic's spread. The creek that provided the camp's water supply was being contaminated by waste from both humans and animals, creating ideal conditions for typhoid bacteria to multiply and infect new victims. "The sickness spreads through contaminated water," Margaret explained to Grey Wolf during their evening consultation. "As long as people continue drinking from water sources that contain waste products, new cases will keep appearing even after we successfully treat existing patients." Grey Wolf grasped the implications immediately. "You're saying that defeating this sickness requires changing how we manage our camp, not just how we treat sick people." The conversation that followed tested Grey Wolf's leadership skills as much as Margaret's medical knowledge. Implementing proper sanitation would require convincing an entire community to modify traditional practices based on invisible causes that contradicted common-sense assumptions about disease transmission. "Many of our people will resist changes that seem unnecessary or disrespectful to traditional ways," Grey Wolf warned. "They will argue that their grandfathers lived healthy lives without following white man's rules about water and waste." Margaret understood the challenge, but she also knew that typhoid fever would continue killing people until the underlying transmission pathways were eliminated. "Perhaps we can present these changes as temporary emergency measures rather than permanent adoptions of white practices," she suggested. "Once the epidemic is over and people see that the changes prevented further deaths, they might be more willing to continue them voluntarily." Grey Wolf's decision to support Margaret's sanitation recommendations demonstrated the kind of courageous leadership that had made him a respected war chief. Despite potential resistance from traditionalists within his own tribe, he announced that all water would be boiled before drinking, waste disposal would follow new protocols, and food preparation would incorporate washing procedures that might seem excessive but could prevent further illness. The implementation of these changes created Margaret's first real test of whether she could earn genuine acceptance within Comanche society. Some tribal members welcomed her expertise and followed her instructions precisely, grateful for any intervention that might save their families. Others viewed her presence with suspicion, wondering whether accepting white medical practices might compromise their cultural identity. The breakthrough in Margaret's relationship with the broader Comanche community came when she successfully treated Grey Wolf's nephew, an 8-year-old boy named Swift Arrow, who had been among the sickest patients when she arrived. Using a combination of rehydration therapy, herbal remedies recommended by Running Bear, and careful nursing care, Margaret was able to bring the child back from the edge of death. Swift Arrow's recovery was witnessed by dozens of tribal members, who had been watching Margaret's treatments with skeptical interest. When the boy sat up and asked for food after 3 days of delirium, the entire camp seemed to exhale with collective relief. The white medicine woman has brought back a child who was already walking toward the spirit world, announced Grey Wolf's sister, Bright Moon, who was Swift Arrow's mother. She deserves our respect and gratitude, regardless of the color of her skin or the strangeness of her methods. Bright Moon's endorsement carried significant weight within the tribe's social structure. As Grey Wolf's sister and the mother of children whose lives had been saved by Margaret's intervention, her opinion influenced other women who had been uncertain about accepting medical advice from an outsider. Margaret found herself increasingly integrated into the camp's daily routines as her treatments proved effective, and her sanitation measures began preventing new cases of typhoid. Women sought her advice about their children's health. Warriors consulted her about treating old injuries that had never healed properly, and elders shared traditional remedies that might complement her medical knowledge. The cultural exchange flowed in both directions. Margaret learned Comanche techniques for preparing medicinal plants, discovered traditional treatments that were surprisingly effective for certain conditions, and gained insights into holistic healing approaches that considered spiritual and social factors alongside physical symptoms. You heal not just bodies, but also the fear and hopelessness that make people sicker, Running Bear observed, after Margaret had been in the camp for 10 days. This is something our best medicine men understand, but few white healers seem to practice. By the end of her second week among the Comanche, Margaret had successfully treated 31 patients with typhoid fever, preventing what could have been dozens of additional deaths. More importantly, she had established sanitation protocols that were preventing new infections and creating the foundation for long-term community health. But Margaret's greatest transformation was personal. Living among the Comanche had shattered every stereotype she had held about Indian culture, revealing a sophisticated society with complex political structures, advanced environmental knowledge, and spiritual traditions that emphasized harmony between human needs and natural systems. Grey Wolf, meanwhile, was discovering that his respect for Margaret's medical expertise was evolving into something deeper and more personal. The white woman who had risked her life to save his people was proving to be someone whose courage, wisdom, and compassion matched qualities he most valued in potential partners. As Margaret prepared for what both she and Grey Wolf assumed would be her return to Fort Mackenzie, neither realized that their collaboration was about to face its greatest test, a crisis that would force them to choose between their separate loyalties and their growing recognition that their futures might be inseparably linked. The crisis that would test Margaret and Grey Wolf's partnership beyond anything they had faced arrived on a scorching July morning in the form of dust clouds on the southern horizon. War Eagle, one of Grey Wolf's most trusted scouts, rode into camp with news that would shatter the fragile peace they had worked so hard to build. Grey Wolf, War Eagle announced breathlessly, "Colonel Marcus Davidson is leading a cavalry column of over 200 soldiers toward our territory. They carry heavy weapons and supply wagons that suggest they intend to establish a permanent military presence, not conduct routine patrols." Margaret felt her blood run cold as she processed this information. Colonel Davidson was notorious throughout Texas for his brutal approach to Indian relations, believing that the only effective policy was complete subjugation or extermination of indigenous peoples. His arrival in the region meant that the careful negotiations between Grey Wolf and Fort Mackenzie were about to be overwhelmed by military forces that had no interest in peaceful coexistence. Grey Wolf's reaction revealed the kind of strategic thinking that had made him an effective war chief. Instead of responding with immediate anger or panic, he began calculating options and gathering intelligence that would inform whatever response the situation demanded. How far away is Davidson's column, and what route are they following? Grey Wolf asked War Eagle, while simultaneously signaling for the camp's other senior warriors to join their emergency council. 2 days' hard ride to the south, moving northeast along the Clear Fork River. At their current pace, they will reach Fort Mackenzie before the new moon. But Grey Wolf, there's something else you need to know. They're driving a large herd of cattle ahead of them, and they've burned out 3 homesteads whose owners tried to resist having their property confiscated. Margaret realized that Davidson's expedition represented more than military intimidation. He was implementing a scorched earth policy designed to eliminate all civilian infrastructure that might provide support for Indian resistance, while simultaneously establishing economic control over the region's resources. "This changes everything," Margaret said quietly, understanding the implications for both Grey Wolf's people and the fragile partnership they had developed. Davidson won't honor treaties or negotiate settlements. He believes the only solution to Indian troubles is military conquest, followed by forced relocation. Grey Wolf nodded grimly, his expression showing the weight of decisions that would determine his people's survival. "Miss Sullivan, your presence in our camp has created complications that neither of us anticipated. If Davidson discovers that we've been harboring a white woman, he will use that as justification for attacking us, regardless of any peaceful intentions we might demonstrate." The conversation that followed forced Margaret to confront the reality that her medical mission among the Comanche had political dimensions she hadn't fully considered. Her presence in Grey Wolf's camp could be interpreted as evidence of collaboration between the Comanche and Fort Mackenzie, potentially triggering military action that would destroy both communities. "I should return to Fort Mackenzie immediately," Margaret concluded, though the prospect of leaving unfinished medical work made her feel like she was abandoning people who depended on her care. "My continued presence here puts your entire tribe at risk," but Grey Wolf's response revealed that the situation had evolved beyond simple risk management. The typhoid epidemic that had brought them together was only one of several crises threatening his people's survival, and Margaret's departure might eliminate their best hope for navigating the broader challenges they faced. "Miss Sullivan, Davidson's approach represents a threat that military resistance alone cannot defeat. His cavalry column is too large for us to fight successfully, and retreat deeper into Comanche territory would only delay inevitable confrontation. We need strategies that go beyond traditional warfare." Margaret began to understand that Grey Wolf was contemplating something unprecedented, using her medical expertise and cultural knowledge to develop non-military responses to military threats. The idea was both brilliant and terrifying, requiring them to trust each other with stakes that went far beyond personal safety. "What are you suggesting?" Margaret asked, though she suspected she already understood the direction of Grey Wolf's thinking. "I'm suggesting that we use your knowledge of white political systems and my understanding of Comanche survival strategies to create solutions that neither culture could develop alone. Davidson expects to face traditional Indian resistance that he knows how to defeat. He won't be prepared for responses that challenge his basic assumptions about how conflicts between our peoples must be resolved." The plan that emerged from their emergency council session was audacious beyond anything either Margaret or Grey Wolf had previously contemplated. Instead of choosing between military confrontation and strategic retreat, they would attempt to neutralized Davidson's threat through a combination of medical intervention, political maneuvering, and cultural diplomacy that had never been attempted on the Texas frontier. The first element of their strategy involved Margaret's return to Fort Mackenzie, but not as a simple evacuation from danger. Instead, she would serve as an envoy carrying proposals for cooperation that might convince Captain Harrison to resist Davidson's more extreme policies. Captain Harrison is a reasonable man who understands the value of peaceful relations with local tribes, Margaret argued. If I can present him with evidence that military cooperation between Fort Mackenzie and the Comanche could benefit both communities, he might be willing to oppose Davidson's destructive policies. Grey Wolf's contribution to their strategy involved something far more risky, a direct appeal to Davidson himself, using Margaret's presence as proof that peaceful cooperation between whites and Indians was not only possible, but actively beneficial to both cultures. Davidson will expect to find evidence of Comanche savagery and white victimization, Grey Wolf explained. Instead, he will discover a white woman who has been treated with honor and respect while saving Indian lives through medical cooperation. This might force him to reconsider his assumptions about the impossibility of peaceful coexistence. The plan required Margaret to trust Grey Wolf with her safety in ways that went far beyond anything they had previously attempted. She would remain in the Comanche camp as Davidson's column approached, serving as living proof that cultural cooperation could produce outcomes beneficial to both peoples. But their strategy faced immediate opposition from within Grey Wolf's own tribe. Several senior warriors argued that keeping a white woman in camp during a military crisis was invitation to disaster, while others insisted that any cooperation with white authorities was betrayal of Comanche independence. Thundercloud, Grey Wolf's most experienced war chief, voiced the concerns that many tribal members shared. Grey Wolf, this white woman has earned our respect through her healing work, but she remains a white woman whose presence gives our enemies weapons to use against us. Davidson will claim that we kidnapped her, regardless of the truth about how she came to be here. The debate that followed tested Grey Wolf's leadership in ways that pure military challenges never had. He needed to convince his own people to accept risks that contradicted traditional approaches to tribal security, while simultaneously preparing for the possibility that their unprecedented strategy might fail catastrophically. Thundercloud speaks wisdom that we must consider carefully, Grey Wolf acknowledged. But we must also consider that traditional responses to military threats have not prevented the steady loss of our territory and the destruction of our way of life. Perhaps it is time to try methods that our ancestors could not have imagined, because they faced enemies who were different from those we face today. Margaret found herself caught between competing loyalties that she had never expected to experience. Her commitment to completing the medical work that had brought her to the Comanche camp conflicted with recognition that her presence might endanger the very people she was trying to help. Grey Wolf, I cannot ask your people to accept risks on my behalf that they didn't choose freely, Margaret said during their private strategy session. If staying here might bring military retaliation against your tribe, then I should leave, regardless of what it means for our cooperative plans. Grey Wolf's response revealed depths of personal feeling that he had not previously expressed. Miss Sullivan, you have become more than a healer, helping my people survive an epidemic. You have become someone whose wisdom and courage have earned a place in our community that goes beyond temporary medical assistance. Asking you to leave now would be like asking us to abandon part of ourselves. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Bright Moon, who brought news that would complicate their strategic planning in unexpected ways. Swift Arrow, the boy whose recovery from typhoid had demonstrated the effectiveness of Margaret's treatments, was showing symptoms of a different illness that traditional Comanche remedies couldn't address. The child burns with fever again, but this sickness is different from the one that almost killed him before, Bright Moon explained. He cannot keep food in his stomach, and there are strange marks appearing on his skin that we have never seen. Margaret's examination of Swift Arrow revealed symptoms that suggested scarlet fever, a bacterial infection that could be fatal if not treated properly. The disease was particularly dangerous for children who had been weakened by previous illnesses, and Swift Arrow's recent recovery from typhoid made him especially vulnerable. "This is a different kind of emergency," Margaret told Grey Wolf after completing her medical assessment. "Swift Arrow needs immediate treatment with medicines that I don't have with me. The supplies I need are at Fort Mackenzie, but getting them here and back again could take too long to save his life." The medical crisis forced Grey Wolf to make decisions that balanced personal anguish against strategic necessities. Swift Arrow was not just any child in the tribe. He was Grey Wolf's nephew and the son of his beloved sister, representing both family loyalty and the future of Comanche leadership. "Miss Sullivan, could Davidson's medical supplies include the medicines that Swift Arrow needs?" Grey Wolf asked, recognizing that their enemy's approach might also represent an unexpected opportunity. Margaret understood immediately what Grey Wolf was suggesting. Davidson's cavalry column would certainly include a military surgeon with medical supplies that could save Swift Arrow's life. But accessing those supplies would require negotiations that could either establish the foundation for peaceful cooperation or trigger the violent confrontation they were trying to avoid. "It's possible," Margaret replied. "Military expeditions always carry medicines for treating common diseases, but approaching Davidson's column to request medical assistance would be incredibly dangerous for both of us." Grey Wolf's decision to pursue this option revealed the kind of courage that had made him a respected leader. Despite the enormous risks involved, he was willing to place his faith in Margaret's assessment that Davidson might respond to humanitarian appeals even if he rejected political negotiations. "Miss Sullivan, if you are willing to approach Davidson's column under a flag of truce, I will provide escort that ensures your safe passage. We will present ourselves as people seeking medical cooperation rather than military confrontation, and see whether Davidson is capable of responding to appeals based on saving children's lives rather than abstract political principles." As they prepared for what would be either a breakthrough in cross-cultural cooperation or a catastrophic miscalculation, both Margaret and Grey Wolf understood that their partnership was about to face its ultimate test. The approach of Davidson's cavalry column had raised the stakes beyond personal safety to encompass the survival of everything they had worked together to build. The debt that had originally brought them together was evolving into something far more complex. A shared commitment to proving that people from different cultures could find common ground, even in the midst of conflicts that seemed to make cooperation impossible. Their next moves would determine not only Swift Arrow's survival, but whether the bridge they had built between their two worlds could withstand the forces of hatred and misunderstanding that threatened to destroy everything they had accomplished together. The approach to Colonel Davidson's cavalry column required planning that balanced Margaret's medical knowledge with Grey Wolf's understanding of military psychology. They rode toward the enemy camp in the pre-dawn darkness, carrying a white flag, improvised from one of Margaret's petticoats, and accompanied by War Eagle and Thundercloud as witnesses to whatever would unfold. Margaret had never seen a military force the size of Davidson's expedition. The cavalry column stretched across nearly a mile of prairie, with supply wagons, artillery pieces, and over 200 mounted soldiers arranged in defensive formations that could respond instantly to any perceived threat. The sheer scale of military power was designed to intimidate anyone who might consider resistance. "Remember," Grey Wolf said quietly, as they prepared to announce their presence, Davidson expects us to approach as enemies seeking mercy or supplicants begging for terms. Instead, we come as equals offering cooperation that serves interests he might not have considered. The challenge of their diplomatic mission went beyond language barriers or cultural misunderstandings. Davidson's reputation was built on the premise that Indians were incapable of civilized behavior and that military force was the only effective means of communication between whites and native peoples. Margaret and Grey Wolf needed to challenge those fundamental assumptions within the first few minutes of contact. Their approach was spotted by cavalry pickets when they were still half a mile from the main column. Within moments, a squad of mounted soldiers was riding toward them with weapons ready and expressions that suggested they viewed any Indian presence as inherently threatening. "That's far enough," shouted Sergeant Major William Hayes, the lead cavalry officer. "State your business and keep your hands visible, or we'll assume hostile intent." Margaret spurred her horse forward, positioning herself between Grey Wolf and the cavalry soldiers while raising the white flag high enough to be unmistakable. "Sergeant, I'm Margaret Sullivan, medical officer from Fort Mackenzie. I'm here to request a meeting with Colonel Davidson regarding urgent medical assistance for a critically ill child." The shock on Sergeant Hayes's face was exactly what Margaret had hoped to achieve. Instead of finding the stereotypical image of savage Indians threatening civilized travelers, the cavalry patrol was confronted with a white woman who appeared to be traveling voluntarily with Comanche warriors and speaking as their representative. "Ma'am, are you being held against your will?" Hayes asked, clearly struggling to reconcile Margaret's presence with his expectations about Indian behavior. "Absolutely not," Margaret replied firmly. "I've been working as a medical consultant with Grey Wolf's people for the past 3 weeks, treating an epidemic that has killed several children. We're here because another child is critically ill and needs medicines that only Colonel Davidson's medical supplies can provide." The conversation that followed tested every assumption the cavalry soldiers held about the nature of white-Indian relations. Instead of a rescue scenario involving a captive white woman, they were being asked to participate in medical cooperation between supposed enemies. Grey Wolf's contribution to their diplomatic approach demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of white psychology that had made him an effective war chief. Rather than speaking as a supplicant requesting assistance, he addressed Sergeant Hayes as one military professional, acknowledging another's expertise. "Sergeant Hayes, the child who needs medical assistance is my nephew, 8 years old, recently recovered from typhoid fever through Miss Sullivan's treatment. We understand that military expeditions carry medicines for treating scarlet fever, which is what threatens his life now. We are prepared to offer fair exchange for access to those medical supplies." The mention of fair exchange transformed their meeting from a charity request into a business negotiation, forcing the cavalry soldiers to consider what the Comanche might possess that would be valuable to a military expedition. Grey Wolf was deliberately presenting his people as trading partners rather than defeated enemies. Sergeant Hayes found himself in a situation that his military training had never prepared him to handle. His orders were to maintain security and report any Indian contact to Colonel Davidson, but those orders assumed that such contact would involve either hostile action or surrender negotiations. "I'll need to escort you to Colonel Davidson," Hayes decided after conferring briefly with his fellow soldiers, "but understand that you'll be under armed guard until the colonel determines how to proceed." The ride to Davidson's command tent provided Margaret with her first close look at the military force that threatened everything she and Grey Wolf had worked to build. The soldiers were well equipped and disciplined, but their faces showed the kind of hardened attitudes that came from viewing all Indians as dangerous enemies who deserved no consideration beyond what military necessity required. Colonel Marcus Davidson proved to be exactly what Margaret had expected, a career military officer whose worldview had been shaped by decades of frontier warfare and whose solution to complex problems was usually the application of overwhelming force. He was a man in his 50s, weather-beaten from years of campaign life, with eyes that showed intelligence but little tolerance for approaches that challenged his established methods. "Miss Sullivan," Davidson said after reviewing the report, "from Sergeant Hayes, your presence here requires explanation that goes beyond medical emergencies. How did you come to be traveling with hostile Indians, and what assurances do I have that you're not being coerced into serving as their spokesman?" Margaret understood that her answer would determine not only whether Swift Arrow received needed medical treatment, but whether Davidson would view her partnership with Grey Wolf as evidence of successful cooperation or proof of Indian treachery. "Colonel, I came to Grey Wolf's camp voluntarily after he requested medical assistance for a typhoid epidemic that was killing his people. I've spent 3 weeks treating patients, training Comanche healers in disease prevention, and establishing sanitation protocols that have saved dozens of lives. I'm here now because a child needs medicines that I don't have access to." Davidson's response revealed the depth of his skepticism about any narrative that portrayed Indians in a positive light. "Miss Sullivan, what you're describing contradicts everything we know about Comanche behavior toward white captives. Are you certain that you haven't been conditioned to present their actions in the most favorable possible terms?" The question struck at the heart of colonial assumptions about the impossibility of voluntary cooperation between whites and Indians. Davidson could accept the idea that Margaret might have been forced to provide medical services, but he couldn't easily process the possibility that she had chosen to work with the Comanche as equals. Grey Wolf's intervention at this crucial moment demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking that had made their partnership effective. Instead of responding defensively to Davidson's skepticism, he offered verification that would allow the colonel to judge their claims independently. "Colonel Davidson, you are welcome to send your own medical officer to examine the patients, Miss. Sullivan has treated and evaluated the effectiveness of her methods. You will find evidence of medical cooperation that has benefited both our peoples, not coercion or deception." The offer to allow independent verification put Davidson in a difficult position. If he accepted Grey Wolf's invitation and discovered evidence of successful medical cooperation, it would challenge his fundamental beliefs about the impossibility of peaceful Indian relations. If he refused, he would appear to be avoiding evidence that might contradict his preconceptions. Margaret recognized the opportunity that Grey Wolf had created and pressed their advantage by appealing to Davidson's professional responsibilities as a military commander charged with protecting civilian populations. "Colonel, the typhoid epidemic that brought us together didn't respect racial boundaries. Disease can spread from Indian camps to white settlements just as easily as it spreads within either population. The sanitation methods we've implemented in Grey Wolf's camp could prevent outbreaks that might threaten Fort Mackenzie or other white communities." This argument reframed their medical cooperation from an act of charity toward Indians into a public health initiative that served white interests. Davidson was being asked to consider whether preventing disease outbreaks among hostile populations might be more effective than waiting to treat them after they spread to friendly settlements. But the conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Major Robert Clayton, Davidson's chief medical officer, who brought news that would change the entire dynamic of their negotiation. "Colonel, we've received reports of suspicious illness among the cattle herd we've been driving ahead of our column. Several animals are showing symptoms that suggest anthrax contamination. If that's confirmed, we could be facing a veterinary emergency that threatens both our food supplies and the health of our horses." Margaret felt her pulse quicken as she processed the implications of Major Clayton's report. Anthrax was a bacterial disease that could spread from infected animals to humans. potentially creating an epidemic that would devastate both Davidson's cavalry column and any civilian populations they encountered. "Major Clayton," Margaret said, stepping forward with the authority of someone who had extensive experience treating bacterial diseases, "I've dealt with anthrax contamination during livestock outbreaks in Missouri. The disease requires immediate quarantine procedures and specific treatments that can prevent it from spreading to humans." Davidson found himself confronting the possibility that the white woman he had assumed was a victim of Indian coercion might possess medical knowledge that could save his entire expedition from a catastrophic disease outbreak. Grey Wolf's response to this development demonstrated the kind of leadership that could transform enemies into allies. "Colonel Davidson, Miss Sullivan's expertise with infectious diseases could benefit your soldiers just as it has benefited my people. Perhaps this crisis provides an opportunity for cooperation that serves everyone's interests." The moral choice that followed would define not only the immediate fate of Swift Arrow and Davidson's cavalry column, but the broader question of whether peaceful cooperation between whites and Indians was possible on the Texas frontier. Margaret realized that she was standing at a crossroads where her medical knowledge could either bridge the gap between two cultures or become another weapon in the conflict that was destroying both. Her next words would determine whether Davidson viewed her as a resource to be protected or a threat to be eliminated. "Colonel, I propose a medical exchange that could address both of our emergencies. Your surgeon can provide the scarlet fever, medicines that Swift Arrow needs to survive, while I can provide the expertise you need to prevent anthrax from spreading through your expedition. Both communities benefit, and we establish a precedent for cooperation that might prevent future conflicts." Davidson stared at Margaret for a long moment, weighing military doctrine against practical necessities. His decision would test whether a career soldier could adapt his worldview when confronted with evidence that contradicted everything he had been taught about Indian relations. The silence stretched between them like a bridge that might either connect two worlds or collapse under the weight of prejudices that neither side was ready to abandon. In that moment, the debt that had brought Margaret and Grey Wolf together was about to become either the foundation for unprecedented cooperation or the catalyst for a conflict that would destroy everything they had worked to build. Swift Arrow's life hung in the balance, but so did the possibility that two peoples who had been taught to see each other as irreconcilable enemies might discover that their survival depended on learning to see each other as essential allies. Colonel Davidson's decision came after the longest 30 seconds of Margaret's life. She watched his weathered face process calculations that went far beyond immediate medical emergencies, weighing decades of military doctrine against the practical realities of frontier survival that were forcing impossible choices. "Major Clayton," Davidson finally said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had made countless life-and-death decisions, "prepare the medical supplies Miss Sullivan requires for treating scarlet fever, and gather everything we know about the livestock situation. I want a full assessment of how serious this anthrax threat might become." Margaret felt a surge of relief so intense it left her momentarily lightheaded. Davidson was choosing pragmatic cooperation over ideological purity, recognizing that survival sometimes required partnerships with people you had been taught to consider enemies. But Grey Wolf's reaction revealed deeper understanding of what Davidson's decision truly meant. The colonel wasn't just authorizing medical assistance. He was acknowledging that Comanche people possessed knowledge and capabilities that white military forces needed to survive in Texas territory. "Colonel Davidson," Grey Wolf said with the formal courtesy of one leader addressing another, "your willingness to consider cooperation honors both our peoples. I give you my word that Miss Sullivan will return to provide the assistance you need, and that my warriors will ensure her safe passage between our camps." The next 6 hours transformed both military and tribal understanding of what cooperation between enemies could accomplish. Margaret worked alongside Major Clayton to stabilize Swift Arrow's condition using military medical supplies, while simultaneously training Comanche healers in techniques for preventing scarlet fever transmission that could protect other children. In the tribe, Swift Arrow's response to treatment provided dramatic evidence of medical cooperation's effectiveness. Within hours of receiving proper medication, the boy's fever broke and his breathing became less labored. By evening, he was sitting up and asking for food, demonstrating recovery that amazed both white and Indian observers. But Margaret's most significant contribution came when she accompanied Major Clayton to examine Davidson's infected cattle herd. Her experience with anthrax outbreaks in Missouri had taught her to recognize early symptoms that military veterinarians might miss, potentially preventing the disease from spreading to animals that were still healthy. "The infection is more advanced than your initial reports indicated," Margaret told Davidson after completing her livestock assessment. "You have at least 40 animals showing early symptoms, and the bacteria could spread to your horses within days if we don't implement immediate quarantine procedures." Davidson found himself confronting the reality that his entire expedition's mobility depended on knowledge possessed by a woman who was supposed to be either a victim of Indian savagery or an enemy collaborator. Margaret's expertise was becoming indispensable to his mission's success. "What do you recommend?" Davidson asked, his tone showing grudging respect for Margaret's professional capabilities. Margaret's response demonstrated how medical cooperation could create bridges between cultures that had seemed completely incompatible. "We need to separate infected animals from healthy ones immediately, establish decontamination protocols for anyone handling livestock, and treat exposed animals with medicines that can prevent the disease from developing." The implementation of Margaret's recommendations required Davidson to authorize unprecedented cooperation between his soldiers and Comanche warriors. Grey Wolf provided skilled horsemen who could handle dangerous livestock operations, while Margaret supervised medical procedures that combined military supplies with traditional Comanche animal husbandry techniques. Watching white soldiers and Indian warriors worked together to contain the anthrax outbreak created a transformation in attitudes that went far beyond immediate practical necessities. Cavalry troopers who had viewed all Indians as dangerous enemies discovered that Comanche horsemen possessed skills that made them valuable partners in complex operations. Sergeant Hayes, who had initially approached Grey Wolf's party with weapons drawn, found himself working alongside War Eagle to isolate infected cattle. "These Comanche riders know more about handling sick animals than anyone in our cavalry," Hayes admitted to Margaret. "If we'd tried to manage this outbreak without their help, we probably would have lost the entire herd." The cultural exchange flowed in both directions. Comanche warriors observed military organization techniques that could improve their own logistical operations, while cavalry soldiers learned traditional methods for treating animal diseases that were more effective than standard military procedures. But the most significant transformation was occurring between Margaret and Grey Wolf themselves. Working together to solve problems that neither could handle alone was revealing compatibility that went far beyond professional cooperation or mutual respect. "Miss Sullivan," Grey Wolf said during a brief rest between livestock treatments, "you have shown my people and Davidson's soldiers that healing knowledge belongs to whoever can use it wisely, regardless of their birth or the color of their skin. This is wisdom that could change how our people see each other." Margaret realized that Grey Wolf was describing something unprecedented in frontier relations. The possibility that cooperation based on mutual benefit could create lasting alternatives to the cycle of violence that had characterized white Indian interactions across the Texas territory. Grey Wolf, what we've accomplished here could be just the beginning. If Davidson reports successful cooperation between military forces and Comanche people, it might influence how other commanders approach Indian relations. Instead of assuming that conflict is inevitable, they might look for opportunities to work together on problems that affect everyone. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Harrison from Fort McKenzie, accompanied by a small patrol that had ridden hard to reach Davidson's column after receiving reports of the unusual negotiations taking place. "Miss Sullivan," Captain Harrison said, after dismounting and surveying the scene of military Indian cooperation with obvious amazement, "your message about medical cooperation reached Fort McKenzie yesterday. I came to ensure your safety and to observe whether these arrangements are as beneficial as you described." Harrison's presence added another layer of complexity to the evolving situation. As Margaret's original commanding officer, he had authority over her return to Fort McKenzie, but he also represented the kind of moderate military leadership that might support continued cooperation if convinced of its value. Captain Miss Sullivan's medical expertise has prevented what could have been a catastrophic disease outbreak, affecting both our cavalry column and local Indian populations, Davidson explained. Her willingness to work with hostile tribes has created strategic advantages that traditional military approaches couldn't achieve. The conversation between Davidson and Harrison revealed how Margaret and Grey Wolf's partnership was challenging institutional assumptions about frontier policy at the highest levels of military command. Two experienced officers were discussing Indian relations in terms of cooperation rather than conquest, recognizing that some problems required solutions that transcended traditional enemy boundaries. Grey Wolf's contribution to these discussions demonstrated the diplomatic skills that had made him an effective tribal leader. Captain Harrison, the treaty obligations that originally brought Miss Sullivan to my people have evolved into something larger. We have discovered that cooperation serves both our interests better than the conflict that has cost both sides so many lives. Harrison's response showed how witnessing successful cooperation could change deeply held attitudes about the possibility of peaceful Indian relations. Grey Wolf, if what I'm observing here can be sustained and expanded, it might provide a model for preventing the kind of warfare that has devastated communities throughout Texas territory. But their diplomatic breakthrough faced immediate challenges from within both military and tribal hierarchies. Several of Davidson's officers argued that any cooperation with Indians set dangerous precedents that would encourage tribal resistance to military authority. Similarly, some Comanche warriors questioned whether working with white soldiers compromised their people's independence and honor. Thundercloud voiced concerns that reflected broader tribal skepticism about cooperation with traditional enemies. Grey Wolf, these white soldiers smile and speak of friendship while their government continues taking our land and killing our people. How can we trust agreements with individuals when their institutions remain committed to our destruction? The debate that followed tested Grey Wolf's leadership in ways that military challenges never had. He needed to convince his own people that cooperation with specific white leaders could create benefits that outweighed the risks of appearing to accommodate enemy interests. Thundercloud speaks truth that we must face honestly, Grey Wolf acknowledged, but we must also recognize that refusing all cooperation with whites has not prevented the steady loss of our territory or the threats to our people's survival. Perhaps it is time to try building alliances with those whites who demonstrate respect for our capabilities and willingness to honor agreements. Margaret found herself advocating for a partnership that challenged her own cultural assumptions as much as it tested Comanche traditions. "I came to Texas seeking security and stability that I thought could only come from following conventional paths. Instead, I've discovered that the most meaningful work of my life involves cooperation that most people would consider impossible or inappropriate." The resolution of their internal debates came when Swift Arrow, now recovering rapidly from his scarlet fever, approached the group of adults who were discussing his people's future. The 8-year-old boy's presence reminded everyone that their decisions would determine not just immediate survival, but the kind of world they were creating for the next generation. "Uncle Grey Wolf," Swift Arrow said in English that he had been learning from Margaret. "The white medicine woman saved my life twice. First from the sickness that almost killed me, and now from the new sickness that would have killed me if she hadn't been here to help. If she can save Indian children and white children, maybe grown-ups can learn to help each other too." The wisdom of a child who had been saved by cross-cultural cooperation provided the moral clarity that complex political arguments had obscured. Swift Arrow's survival was proof that some problems required people to work together regardless of their differences, and that such cooperation could create benefits that neither culture could achieve alone. Davidson's final decision reflected how witnessing successful cooperation could transform even the most hardened military attitudes. "Gentlemen, what we've accomplished here suggests that our standard approaches to Indian relations may be unnecessarily limited. I'm prepared to recommend that Fort Mackenzie and Grey Wolf's people establish formal protocols for medical and agricultural cooperation that serve both communities' interests." As the sun set over the Texas prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Margaret and Grey Wolf stood together watching their two peoples work side by side to complete the livestock decontamination that would protect both communities from disease. The debt that had originally brought them together had evolved into something far more valuable, a partnership that proved cooperation between supposed enemies was not only possible but essential for survival in a changing world. Their love story was also becoming a story about the transformation of entire communities, learning to see former enemies as indispensable allies. 6 months after the debt that brought them together had transformed into a partnership that saved two communities, Margaret Sullivan stood in the doorway of a log cabin that represented something unprecedented in Texas territory. A home built jointly by Comanche warriors and Army engineers, designed to serve as headquarters for the first formal medical cooperation program between white and Indian communities. The cabin sat on neutral ground between Fort Mackenzie and Grey Wolf's winter camp, positioned to serve both populations while belonging exclusively to neither. Inside, shelves lined with medical supplies from 3 cultures, American pharmaceuticals, Mexican herbal remedies, and traditional Comanche medicines, created a pharmacy that could address health challenges no single tradition could handle. Alone, Margaret's transformation from a desperate woman fleeing debt to a respected healer serving 2 communities had been remarkable, but it paled beside the changes in the broader political landscape that her partnership with Grey Wolf had helped create. What had begun as emergency medical cooperation had evolved into agricultural exchanges, technological sharing, and diplomatic protocols that were being studied by government officials from Washington to Mexico City. "Mrs. Grey Wolf," called Martha Rodriguez, who had traveled from Fort Mackenzie to assist with the day's medical consultations, "we have 17 patients waiting for treatment, including 3 cavalry soldiers, 8 Comanche tribal members, 4 Mexican settlers, and 2 families of German immigrants." The diversity of patients seeking treatment at their medical center reflected how word of successful cross-cultural healing had spread throughout the region. People who might normally have avoided contact with traditional enemies were willing to travel hundreds of miles to receive care that combined the best knowledge from multiple medical traditions. Margaret smiled at Martha's use of her married name, still occasionally surprised by how naturally she had adapted to life as the wife of a Comanche war chief. The wedding ceremony 3 months earlier had been conducted according to both Christian and Comanche traditions, witnessed by representatives from Fort Mackenzie, Grey Wolf's tribe, and several neighboring communities that had learned to see their partnership as proof that cooperation between different peoples was possible. Grey Wolf emerged from the cabin's back room, where he had been meeting with Captain Harrison and 2 territorial officials about expanding their medical cooperation program to other regions of Texas. His presence no longer caused the automatic tension it had once generated among white officials, who had learned to see him as a valuable partner in maintaining regional stability. "Margaret," Grey Wolf said, using her English name during official business as they had agreed, "the territorial officials are interested in establishing similar medical centers at 3 other locations along the frontier. They want to know if we would be willing to train other couples to manage programs like ours." The possibility of expanding their model across Texas territory represented validation of everything Margaret and Grey Wolf had worked to prove. Government officials, who had initially viewed their partnership with suspicion, were now actively seeking to replicate their success in other areas where white Indian conflict was hampering regional development. "What would that involve?" Margaret asked, though she suspected she already knew the scope of what was being proposed. Captain Harrison joined their conversation, carrying documents that outlined the territorial government's ambitious plans for frontier medical cooperation. Mrs. Grey Wolf, the success you've achieved here has caught attention at the highest levels of government. Secretary of War Jefferson Davis himself has requested detailed reports about your methodology." The mention of Jefferson Davis, who would later become President of the Confederacy but was currently focused on frontier policy, indicated how significant Margaret and Grey Wolf's work had become in national discussions about westward expansion and Indian relations. Grey Wolf's response revealed the careful political thinking that had made their partnership effective. "Captain Harrison, we would be honored to share our knowledge with other communities, but any expansion must respect the specific needs and traditions of the peoples involved. What works between my tribe and Fort Mackenzie might require adaptation for different tribes and different military installations." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Swift Arrow, now completely recovered from his bout with scarlet fever and serving as an informal interpreter between English-speaking and Comanche-speaking patients. At 9 years old, he had become fluent in medical terminology in both languages and could explain complex treatment procedures to patients regardless of their cultural background. "And Margaret," Swift Arrow said, using the kinship term that reflected Margaret's position within Grey Wolf's extended family, "Mrs. Patterson from the German settlement wants to know if the herbs you gave her for her baby's cough are the same ones that Comanche mothers use for sick children." Margaret smiled at the question, which reflected how patients were beginning to understand that effective medicine drew from multiple knowledge traditions rather than relying on any single cultural approach. "Tell Mrs. Patterson that the herbs come from traditional Comanche knowledge, but we're using them in combination with techniques I learned during the cholera epidemic in St. Louis. The baby is getting the benefit of both types of healing." The integration of different medical traditions had been one of the most challenging aspects of Margaret and Grey Wolf's work together. Creating treatments that combined pharmaceutical medicines with herbal remedies and traditional healing practices required careful experimentation and constant adjustment based on patient responses. Running Bear, who had become Margaret's closest collaborator among the Comanche healers, approached with the day's treatment schedule. "Margaret, we have 3 patients with symptoms that don't match any condition described in your medical books or our traditional knowledge. I believe we're seeing a new type of illness that requires us to develop entirely new treatment approaches." The emergence of unfamiliar diseases was becoming a regular challenge as different populations came into closer contact and as environmental changes created new pathways for disease transmission. Margaret and her team were essentially practicing frontier epidemiology, tracking disease patterns across multiple communities and developing treatments based on careful observation rather than established medical doctrine. "What symptoms are you observing?" Margaret asked, already preparing to examine patients whose conditions might require innovative approaches to diagnosis and treatment. Running Bear's description painted a picture of a respiratory illness that combined elements of pneumonia with skin manifestations that suggested possible environmental contamination. The patients were a Mexican trader, a Comanche hunter, and a German farmer, people from different communities who had no apparent contact with each other except for their presence in the region during the same time period. This could be related to the unusual weather patterns we've been experiencing, Grey Wolf observed, applying the kind of environmental analysis that had made him an effective leader. The extended drought followed by sudden flooding might have created conditions that allow new types of sickness to develop. Margaret realized that Grey Wolf was describing what would later be understood as environmental medicine, the recognition that ecological changes could create new health challenges that required adaptive responses from medical practitioners. Their frontier medical practice was essentially creating new fields of knowledge through necessity. The treatment of the 3 patients with the unknown illness became a collaborative effort that drew on every resource their medical center had developed. Margaret applied diagnostic techniques learned during urban epidemics. Running Bear contributed traditional knowledge about respiratory ailments, and Grey Wolf provided environmental analysis that helped identify possible exposure sources. If this illness is related to environmental contamination from the recent flooding, Margaret reasoned, then the treatment needs to address both the symptoms and the underlying exposure. We need to determine what toxins might have been released by the unusual weather patterns. The investigation that followed led them to discover that the extended drought had concentrated minerals and plant toxins in certain water sources, while the subsequent flooding had dispersed those concentrated toxins across a wider area. People who had consumed water from affected sources were developing a combination of respiratory and dermatological symptoms that required treatment approaches, not found in any traditional medical texts. "This is exactly why our medical cooperation is so important," Grey Wolf observed as they developed treatment protocols for the environmental illness. "No single culture has knowledge that covers all the health challenges people face in a changing world. We need to combine different types of understanding to address problems that none of our ancestors encountered." Their success in treating the environmental illness attracted attention from medical professionals across Texas territory and beyond. Dr. Samuel Morrison from the University of Pennsylvania traveled to their medical center to observe their diagnostic methods and treatment approaches, later publishing papers that described their work as groundbreaking advances in frontier medicine. "Mrs. Grey Wolf," Dr. Morrison said after observing their treatment methods for a week, "what you've developed here represents a new model for medical practice in frontier regions. You're combining empirical observation with traditional knowledge, systems in ways that could revolutionize how we approach healthcare in culturally diverse populations." Margaret's response reflected how her understanding of medicine had evolved through her partnership with Grey Wolf and her work serving multiple communities. "Dr. Morrison, we've learned that effective medicine requires humility, about what any single tradition can accomplish alone, and creativity about how different knowledge systems can complement each other. As autumn painted the Texas landscape, in shades of gold and crimson, Margaret and Grey Wolf stood together outside their medical center, watching their evening patients depart for homes in communities that had once been considered irreconcilably hostile to each other. German immigrants rode alongside Comanche warriors. Mexican families traveled in the company of army soldiers, and children from different cultures played together while their parents received medical treatment. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you had actually met the William Anderson from your letters? Grey Wolf asked, referring to the fictional man whose deception had originally brought Margaret to Texas. Margaret considered the question, though she had long since stopped regretting the romance scam that had led her to Fort Mackenzie. I think I would have discovered fairly quickly that I was looking for something that couldn't be found through correspondence with strangers. What I actually needed was work that mattered and partnership with someone who shared my values. Grey Wolf nodded, understanding that Margaret was describing the difference between fantasy relationships based on projected desires and real partnerships built through shared challenges and mutual respect. The debt that brought us together gave us the opportunity to discover what we could accomplish when we stopped seeing each other as enemies and started working toward common goals. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a courier from Fort Mackenzie, carrying news that would test their partnership in new ways. The territorial government was offering Grey Wolf a formal position as liaison between the U.S. Army and Comanche tribes, while simultaneously offering Margaret appointment as the first official frontier medical officer responsible for serving both white and Indian populations. These positions would require us to spend months traveling between different communities, establishing medical centers, and training other couples to manage cooperation programs, Grey Wolf explained after reading the official correspondence. It would mean leaving the life we've built here to help other people create similar partnerships. Margaret realized that they were being offered the opportunity to transform their personal success into a broader movement that could change how different cultures interacted across the frontier. But accepting would require sacrificing the stability and community they had worked so hard to build. Grey Wolf, when I first came to Texas, I was looking for security and a predictable future. But the most meaningful work of my life has come from accepting challenges that seemed impossible and partnerships that others thought were dangerous. As the stars appeared in the vast Texas sky, Margaret and Grey Wolf made the decision that would define the rest of their lives together. They would accept the territorial appointments, leaving their established medical center to help other communities discover that cooperation between supposed enemies was not only possible, but essential for survival in a changing world. The debt that had originally brought them together had become the foundation for work that neither could accomplish alone, proving that love could bridge any cultural divide when guided by shared purpose and mutual respect. Their story was ending where it had begun, with a journey into unknown territory, but this time they traveled together toward a future they would build as partners. The Comanche warrior who had taken her as payment for debt had indeed found his heart tamed, but Margaret had discovered that her own heart had been equally transformed by learning to see strength, wisdom, and love in someone she had been taught to fear. Together, they had saved not just Grey Wolf's tribe, but created a new model for how different peoples could choose cooperation over conflict when survival required them to see beyond the boundaries of prejudice and fear. Their love story had become a legend that would inspire generations of frontier families, proving that sometimes the most beautiful partnerships grow from the most unlikely circumstances, and that true healing, whether of bodies, communities, or cultures, requires The courage to trust across the deepest divides. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.
Let us know. It's absolutely adorable. I love the little eye. The little eyes, they're so cute. And you are a fellow Moco. Hell yes. I fucking love my Mocos. We're an amazing bunch of people. We truly are. I love everyone I've met through Moco Loco team. But yeah, how was your stream? What did you get up to tonight, Crafty? Totally understand if you have to raid and run at some point. Please do. Please take care of yourself post stream. It's called a cell. Oh, it's a cell. I call him Mito. I drew him for my cousin who is a chemical. Oh, nice. Okay, my apologies. Okay, well, I love that. That's awesome. That's adorable. So you're currently, your current schedule is Tuesday evenings and Sunday afternoons, CST. Okay, awesome. So cross stitch, for cross stitching, and click on the banner to go to my schedule page. Oh, hell yeah. Okay. For card making, you can find updates on Ko-fi or IG. Someday I might stream them again. Okay, hell yeah. It's okay. Worm works too. It's fine. No, I think it was just the way that it was moving in one of the GIF or like one of the animated emotes. I think that's where I think I confused myself. So, but that's awesome. The only thing I've drawn, so when emotes opened up, that's what hell yes. Use your own designs. I fucking love that. That's amazing. I can show you my MS Paint specials, by the way. It happened because of when we were raising money for Starlight. I had one of the redeems be that you could ask me to do an MS Paint, and I was given X amount of time in order to finish it. And so one of them that, well, there's two different emotes that came out of that. And I'll show you in just a second. Oh, I'm not trying to cheer in my own chat. But one of them is the follower emote, which is our, wait, is it not going to come up right now? It's the Jordy emote. It's the loaf. Not, it's kind of a loaf. It's this one, but it won't let me gigantify it for some reason. Or maybe it will. Is it going to let me? It's just kind of weird though that I can't find it. Well, anyway, this is the other emote that came out of that MS Paint special. Was the bonk emote. So, but yeah, for folks that are